All right, well, welcome everyone. We're delighted today to welcome Rupert Reed, who is a professor of philosophy at the University of East Anglia, and who is also co-editor of the book with Jem Bundell, A Deep Adaptation, Navigating the Realities of Climate Chaos, which he's,
There it is.
there it is.
It
Okay,
really
great.
exists. A real book.
A beautiful book, I might add. And we also have with us two parents, because we are going to talk about Rupert's other book, Parents for a Future, which I believe is coming out, and there it is.
Yeah,
Um,
it's now out in the States.
okay, great. How Loving Our Children Can Prevent Climate Collapse is the subtitle. So, and now we have a group of parents. I am a parent. My son is grown, but Amy Jackson is also a parent. Her children are also young adults. And Amy has been part of the zoning committee for responsible development in New Rochelle, which is where we all live. And she's also been part of the PTA group that organizes environmental awareness events at the school where we are close to. And all of us are part of a lake committee because we live in Glenwood Lake and we've tried to save our lake at various times. Justine McClelland is a high school science teacher and also part of the Ecology and Natural Resources Committee of New Rochelle. So welcome to you all. I'd love to start with Rupert. Can you tell us a little bit about deep adaptation, how you got involved with it, and what it is?
Yeah, sure. So deep adaptation, well, it's pretty full on. Deep adaptation is about facing up to the potentiality for eco-driven societal collapse. And that's not something that a lot of people have wanted to talk about until recently, but it is creeping up the agenda because, well, it's so clear that there's such an incredible gap between where we are and where we need to be. And it just seems to widen all the time. The weather keeps spinning out of control. The heat dome this year recently in North America, that kind of thing wasn't supposed to happen for decades to come into the future. You meanwhile have the IPCC report just recently saying Climate Code Red, this crisis is definitely human caused. It is out of control. We've got to move really fast, really hard to stop it. And that was headline news all around the world for about 24 hours. And then things basically went back to the same old of economic growth and COVID and footballers having affairs and, you know, whatever else the news gets preoccupied with. So an increasing number of us have been thinking, look, we have to pay attention to the possibility of societal collapse. That doesn't mean that there's any kind of giving up. On the contrary, even if you think that societal collapse is definitely coming, you shouldn't give up. That's implicit in the deep adaptation concept, that if you think collapse is definitely coming, well, you need to prepare for it. And if you're prepared for it, you'll be much, much better off, and everyone will be much, much better off than if you don't. But speaking for myself, I don't think that eco-driven societal collapse is inevitable. I just think it's kind of probable and becoming more probable, and at the very least, absolutely clearly now possible. So we better prepare for it. Moreover, there's a really interesting point here. Talking about adaptation in general and deep adaptation in particular can be a really good way of focusing people's minds on the reality of the predicament. If we spend all our time talking about 2050 and net zero and so on and so forth, we can sort of fool ourselves into thinking that this crisis is still kind of mostly off into the future. But it's not, it's here, and we can increasingly see that in the weather. But putting our energy more into adaptation and not just into emissions reduction, what gets called in the literature mitigation, putting our energy into adaptation shows that we believe the truth, that the crisis is here. And taking seriously deep adaptation shows that very strongly. If people are preparing for the possibility of climate-driven societal collapse, even if that preparation is so far mostly at the level of just kind of trying to think about it and contemplate and have some kind of psychological preparedness, that again brings home very powerfully the reality of our predicament. So my belief increasingly is that actually, if you're one of those people who are still clearly the majority who think that our effort needs to go mainly into mitigation, into trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, into trying to stop collapse, into trying to make the future less bad or even good, then actually you too should focus more on adaptation, because talking about and doing adaptation is probably now the best way of actually focusing our minds on mitigation and emissions reduction. So deep adaptation is about starting to contemplate the possibility or probability, or in the view of some, the certainty of societal collapse, of eco-driven societal collapse. And yeah, that's what we try to do in the book, looking at all different aspects of the thing, from the science, of course, to philosophical aspects, political aspects, what difference this should make to education. Yeah, does that get us started?
It certainly does. Being parents, of course, we have an obligation to our children. And as you say, our feelings for our children can drive us into greater action. And
Yeah.
so, you know, Amy and Justine, I wonder how you feel about what Rupert was just saying.
Justine, you want to go ahead?
I certainly have not been focusing my mind on societal collapse, so maybe that's something for me to think about. But I definitely, yeah, I mean, having children does make you think about the future and what we're handing off to them.
Yeah.
And realizing, you know, oh, maybe up until this point of my life of parenthood, a lot of my decisions were more self-centered. It was about me, my career, you know, what did I want out of life? Even if it was pursuing a job that's like service oriented, right? And now when you have children, and I think about, well, you know, they might not. I had the privilege of doing things like scuba diving at the Great Barrier Reef. Will that exist for them in 20 years? You know,
Yeah.
there's aspects of this world that are really beautiful and worth preserving, and I'm not sure it will be there for them. So that's one thing, is, you know, I would just be sad if there was a world where we don't have healthy ecosystems. And it's not just about travel, it's also about what we have right here in our backyards, you know, the loss of birds and insects and wildlife locally. So that's where my, I guess, focus has been.
Perhaps I might respond to that, which I found quite powerful, by saying a little bit more about the Parents for a Future book, because the argument, the central argument of that book is directly relevant to what Justine has just said. What I'm really trying to do in the Parents for a Future book, the subtitle is How Loving Our Children Can Prevent Climate Collapse, is to say that traditionally it's been possible and normal for parents to try to take care of their kids by, well, trying to take care of their kids by doing things like getting their kids into an okay school and feeding their kids good food, making sure their kids don't get run over, taking their kids nice places on holidays, and so on and so forth. The argument I make in the book is that, unfortunately, is no longer possible. In other words, if you just do those things, then the likelihood is still that your kids are going to have a pretty terrible future, because we are headed on the road to, well, climate collapse, societal collapse, or even if not that, at the very least to an acceleration of the kind of climate disasters that we've seen aplenty this year. I mean, really a terrifying upsurge in disasters, plus the kind of losses of biodiversity that Justine just mentioned, which are horrible in themselves, and that if they go on stacking up will also be the kind of thing that will undermine the very possibilities of our society existing. I think it was Albert Einstein who once said, if we lose the bees, then we've got about 4 years. If we lose pollinators, sooner or later we're toast, and that's one of the most drastic ways in which ecosystem losses could bite right back against human beings as well. So the argument I make is, if you are someone who, as I think we all do, really cares about profoundly as part of the central meaning of our life, our children, or if we don't have children, our nieces and nephews, or our godchildren or whatever, but for most human beings, they're children. If you care profoundly about your children, then at this point in history, it is necessary, as well as doing all the usual stuff, which I know is incredibly time consuming and so on, to take some interest in these broader questions. Because unless we get our act together and stop climatic collapse and ecosystemic collapses, then our children are going to have a deteriorated and potentially destroyed future. So now, to take care of our children adequately, to love our children adequately, we don't have any alternative but to act collectively to try to safeguard their future. That's a central part of the argument of my book. And well, I think people are finding it pretty powerful, partly because it's pretty undeniable. And its consequences are pretty dramatic. They mean a pretty dramatic reappraisal of the ways in which most human beings, and certainly most parents, think about their lives and what's really important.
Yeah.
Well, of course, there's action on a large scale, as you say. You can protest with your government, you can take to the streets, and then there's also action locally, which I'm hoping to propose in my neighborhood, that we recognize we live just above New York City. Sea levels will rise. There will be migrants coming up from New York. There are droughts in the West. There will be food shortages because the food system is going to break down. We all have yards, and we could take out that grass, and some people have already done this, and start planting food. We could plant, Amy has planted quite a few trees in front of her house to protect against climate change, but also we could plant nut trees. And before World War II, there were trees planted in Europe against famine. And people have described to me how they went into the forest, and thank God for those nuts. So there are a variety of things that people could do locally. And I wonder, Amy, what you think about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, obviously, Dale, you are always put this front and forward in everyone's mind. And Rupert, I'm interested in listening to you speak particularly about collective action and also priorities, because where we live in New Rochelle, a city of 80,000 people, sometimes I find that although my priorities are, environmental, that's not everybody's priority. I mean, we live in a city where, food security is their top issue for their children. And so, so that's a very real reality here. And when you have different priorities on a 24-hour cycle, it's very hard to sort of bump that environmental imperative to the front. And that's sort of one of those things where I always feel like that's the role of government. Like, just tell us what our limits are and I will happily do them. On my own, part of being a parent and raising children, my kids are in their early 20s down to older teen, is just going through life, making choices, explaining to our kids why we made those choices and what our values are through those choices. And then being frank about the areas that we've missed. Like, I feel we've done really a good job in terms of just hyper local choices that we've made, composting and whatnot. And then, and I'm at the other end of the spectrum now where our kids are driving our decisions. So when our 16-year-old car died, our kids were like, there's no way that you're not buying an electric car or a hybrid car. And so it was interesting because they just put my husband and myself on a path, and we were like, okay, this is the range of what we're choosing from. Thank you very much.
Nice.
So, but I also feel like this whole priority thing, how to get everyone to feel the same priority, is really difficult because, you know, the United States is so diverse, and people's economic realities just drive what they can handle.
Yeah, but you know, that's exactly why I think there's a kind of an opportunity here. You're absolutely right. That kind of diversity, that has to be fully taken into account. And that means that any kind of simplistic idea of sort of everybody should just adopt my priorities, whatever those are, is never going to work. On the other hand, there is a very real sense in which the coming crisis, because you ain't seen nothing yet, you know, the appalling climate disasters we've seen this year are just the beginning. The coming crisis really could, if we prepare ourselves properly for it, it could bring us together more in similar kind of ways as the ways in which wars have brought people together before. The difference this time, of course, is that hopefully we wouldn't be fighting against each other, but against the common enemy of well, for example, famine. So, Amy, you mentioned food insecurity. I totally understand what you mean, but again, the thing is, you ain't seen nothing yet. And if people think they're worried about food security now, then just wait 5 or 10 years. That's why we need to get serious about this now and not wait 5 or 10 years. It's not about the environment. It's about life. It's about us. It's about us having a future. It's about long-term food security. And for those people who are really not able to, you know, escape from the 24-hour grind of desperately just trying to keep their lives on the rails, well, okay, then it's up to the rest of us to pull together and try to make sure that we do what's not possible at the moment for those people to do. And of course, you know, of course you're right in saying, look, this crisis is going to hit people very, very differently, and often it's going to be the poor and the underprivileged and so on who get hit the worst. We know that, but we also know that this is potentially going to hit everybody. You look at the recent flooding in Germany, for example. Some of the areas that were smashed up by those floods were the houses of people who were pretty damn well off. There's an intriguing fact that that many of the world's poorest people and many of the world's richest people live on the very edge of water.
Coastal.
Yeah, and it's not just going to be the poor who are vulnerable in what's coming. Of course, the rich are going to find it generally easier to cope, but they are under a serious illusion if they think that they're going to be able to long-term escape from all the consequences of this, including the kind of consequences that we face if we actually get to system collapse or societal collapse. I mean, that's going to bring down virtually everything that we know. You know, it would bring down the internet. It would bring down so many things that wealthy people as well as poor people rely on. So what I'm trying to say is, I really believe that there is a possibility here of finding a way of pulling people together and say, look, across all this diversity, we actually do have some pretty serious common interests here. And it's beholden upon those of us who have a little bit more resource and a little bit more possibility of seeing where we are and what's coming, to try to do some of that pulling together and to try to enable us to, in that way, prepare ourselves together for what's coming. And that is part of what I mean by saying this is a problem for us collectively.
Well, that preparedness exists in different ways in different parts of the world. One of the things is that we have to recognize that our growth system of economics, of course, is ridiculous. There's no infinite growth on our little planet. Our overproduction of a lot of things we do not need is very damaging. And, you know, Rupert, you talked about this in one of your books, it's really the producers and the advertisers and this whole game that's really started and gotten into gear around 1950. Let's sell people all this stuff, you know, that they didn't need before, and have been wasting our resources. One of the things, of course, is our diet, and wasting the resources to produce all this meat has been a terrible disaster for lots of areas. Certainly the West is suffered in America because the Ogallala, the aquifer, is being drained. Lake Mead is being drained. We won't have water to drink because we're feeding it to the cows right now. We're growing feed for cows. We have to stop that aspect of it. in all ways, and every you know, every event I've tried to, in some of our neighborhood events, I've tried to say, well, hey, let's try those veggie burgers. Let's bring in those, you know, other kinds of alternate sausages. Let's get off of this meat thing, and make those events learning events in some way. Try this. And by the way, here's this, you know, little pamphlet of information about what's happening to the
Mm,
climate in relation to
mm,
these things.
mm.
You know, so food is so critical,
So
and the
critical.
food, yeah, the food we eat now is either going to kill us or help us.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm so glad you brought that up. You know, food is just is so central, and you know, it's encouraging to hear that you all in your community there are trying to think about this and act on it on a small scale, on a community level, etc. That's the kind of thing that needs to be happening all over the country and all over the world. But I'm also really glad, Dale, that you put this in the context of the system and the way that the system tries to get us to think about this. Because what it tries to do is get us to think of ourselves not as citizens, but as consumers, as sort of as if what we really are is sort of one kind of gigantic mouth, kind of turning everything that there is into a waste product, and getting some kind of little kind of pinpricks of happiness, hopefully, along the way. And I think we can be so much more than that, can do so much better than that. And of course, what they're trying to do when they do that, as you implied, is they're trying to escape their own responsibility. And the marketers and the sellers and the advertisers, and of course the producers who want their stuff sold and advertised, and who want us to think that we need it, I mean, and that we need endlessly ever more of it. These people have a much greater responsibility for the situation that we're in, for the system crisis that we're in, than we consumers, we citizens. Yeah, I think if this is really understood and acted on, it's a revolutionary kind of change of perception. All the relentless propaganda about kind of your carbon footprint and the choices that you make being what determines whether the future is good or not. Of course, there's an element of truth in it. Of course, we should all take responsibility for what we do, for what we eat, for what we buy, etc. But firstly, putting that focus on the so-called consumer takes away the focus from the way that they try to systematically rig the system so that we have to think of ourselves as or be consumers. And secondly, it individualizes us and takes away from us this crucial dimension of collectivity, of community, of society, of citizenship. If we manage to get through this, and as I said at the start, my own view is that that isn't particularly likely, but I'm still obviously striving for it and trying to help make it possible. If we get through this, it will be because we escaped the way that they try to set us up for failure by setting us up as consumers. It will be because we pull together instead as communities, as citizens, and realize that only if we act collectively is it conceivable that we could do enough and fast enough. There is no way that we get through this by simply making good decisions in our shopping and growing some vegetables in our back garden. There is no way. Those are important, but what is even more important is that we get resilience building and real change at the community level, that we get it at the societal level, that through the political system, at least quite a lot of choices in the right direction get made. Don't get me wrong, you know, I don't have a great deal of faith in the political system as it stands in countries like the USA and the UK. It needs drastic reform, probably isn't going to get that reform. The political system, at least until we take our passion to it and take our citizenship to it and take our responsibilities on in terms of the way we choose to challenge it in a much more profound way, is not going to rise up to the challenge. But unless there is at least some change on the political and democratic level, and unless at least there isn't resistance to the changes that we are trying to make at that level, then again, we really are completely stuffed. So yeah, we need to escape this paradigm of being framed as consumers and think of ourselves instead as citizens who are coming together to conserve what we have and conserve what matters for us, and to create a future for our children, and to challenge the power of the producers and the advertisers and the dodgy politicians, who are the ones who have much more responsibility than us for the mess that we now find ourselves in.
I just wanted to ask a question, because I'm hearing you say two different things, that individual actions are not enough, like growing our own vegetable patch, whatnot. That's not enough. At the same time, I'm hearing you saying that there is no political solution that you see happening. And so what my question is then, this, you're suggesting a third way, I'm thinking, but what that actually looks like, to me, I don't understand. Where I sit as a parent,
thank you.
Where I sit as a parent, I see it a little differently. I see I'm making choices for my family based on values, hoping that that continues and is furthered with my children. At the same time, I'm absolutely demanding political solutions from our government. I don't want to have the option of wrapping my vegetables in plastic when I go to the grocery store. I don't want my berries to come in plastic containers. I don't want to buy things that are primarily 90% water, 5% soap. Like that's the type of stuff where I don't even want to have those choices to make. It's too overwhelming to sort through this stuff on the individual level. And that is what government is. And so I know you're saying it's collapsing, but until it does collapse, that is the role I want my government in. So what what are you?
You're absolutely, it's a great analysis, you've seen exactly what I'm trying to say. So, how do these things square up? Well, let me try to explain. So one of the things I'm saying is, individual action is great, but it's not going to be enough. Political action is necessary, but political action within the current system is also not going to be enough. So what are the implications of that? One implication of that is we better start preparing for potential collapse, right? Because it looks very likely, is the way I see it, that what is being done, even if it gets changed for the better in various ways that are foreseeable, is not going to be enough. So we better start preparing.
Individuals prepare or governmental prepare?
Both. Individuals, if individuals improve their preparedness, that's excellent. If government starts to wake up a bit more and improve its preparedness, that's excellent. But within the current paradigm, it's not going to be enough. So we better prepare for potential collapse. But what I also believe, and I hope this speaks to you as parents, and this is certainly a central thrust of what I'm aiming at in my book, Parents for a Future, is that when people start to see this and understand it, and understand there are no adults in the room, there is no cavalry, no one is going to rescue us. We are heading off a cliff, or as I often put it, in fact, we are already off the cliff, and we have to try to turn around and scramble back up the cliff face. When more and more people see that, as more and more people are seeing that, when people hear about the IPCC report, when people see the wave after wave of more and more terrifying, unprecedented weather events, which are climate events, when they see, as I'm afraid they are virtually certainly going to see, the COP at Glasgow later this year, the climate conference, failing us, they will realize that the only thing which is going to be potentially enough is a mass movement that rises up collectively to change the frame, to change the system, to challenge politics as usual in a more radical way than even someone like Sanders wants to do. And that's the kind of thing which is being modeled in the United States by the Sunrise Movement, and more strongly by Extinction Rebellion, and in a slightly different way by some of the school climate strikers, who of course are great heroes and allies of mine. So part of my argument in Parents for a Future is what we need, and I believe what we are going to see in the 2020s, and I'm just praying that it doesn't come too late, what we need is a much larger upsurge, which I think could and should come from the leadership of parents, stepping up into this space of responsibility and saying, you know, I'm not prepared anymore to see my child put at risk in this way, and I'm not prepared to leave it up to children to stand to come forward and say, save our world. I'm going to start doing it myself. So we're going to start doing it ourselves. I'm arguing for, and I believe that there will be a large emergent parents movement that changes the game, and that produces a kind of system change, that produces a kind of transformation that could actually be enough. Now, that's an incredibly bold thing to say, but we're at a time in history when if we don't say incredibly bold things, then we might as well not say anything at all.
One of the things that you have talked about, which I really love, is the fact that out of crisis often comes, only out of crisis usually comes real change. That as our consumer-oriented, separatist, totally unequal society, so out of balance with nature, collapses of its own weight and its own, well, stupidity, that a new civilization, a new society could arise where people are cooperating, where, you know, we're not dependent on international travel or goods that come from across the world. Will have understood that we need to look locally. We need to live in a better, more compassionate, more aware way with each other rather than buying things. Let's get together, you know. Let's be people first, consumers much later. We get the things we need, but you know, what does society mean? What is society really? And we might get to a society that really looks at that. Oh, society is a group of people. Love is the basis of society. Amy.
Yeah, Dale, I love that that thought, and I think that that's mimicked, Rupert, in what you said about we're citizens first, consumers somewhere way down the line. The two things that I haven't heard mentioned is, so about 15 years ago, the term sustainability and a triple bottom line was something that was at the forefront of this movement. That has not been mentioned once in this conversation. Also, the idea of deep adaptation. So for me, that almost has another meaning, because my kids are on this science track in biology. And so I think the way they've channeled the environmental, I know you don't like that term, but this issue into their life is to actually become problem solvers. So deep adaptation in terms of not just the idea of, like, we're talking about just everyone stop, like that's humans we're programmed to do. So for me, deep adaptation, although it's probably not your concept, is adaptation of technology and the way we do things, and in terms of biomimicry, right? So trying to use science to solve some of our problems. And I don't know, I guess because I have you here, I'm just curious as to how you think, is this whole triple bottom line an outdated concept for you and your movement? And is there any proactive stream within of your thinking and your movement that it's not just stop, but also do?
Yeah, great. Absolutely, it's got to be do as well as stop. Although I think there's a lot of power in stopping, in pausing, in reflecting, in becoming a little bit more meditative, etc. I think that's something that we could really use a lot more of in our failing civilization. I'm gonna pick on another of the words that you use. This word sustainability, which is generally a sort of hooray word, and everyone thinks, yeah, sustainability, that's what we need. Again, I'm a bit of a skeptic of sustainability, because I always ask, sustainability of what? And it seems to me that usually when people talk about sustainability, they mean something like, well, sustainability of what we currently have. No, what we currently have cannot be sustained. And people often talk also about sustainable development. Well, that's a bit like talking about clean coal. A lot of what development has come to mean basically just is growth. And there, if you try to sustain that, you will fail. And the more you try to sustain it, the more you're just building up trouble ahead. So what I like to talk about is what kind of civilization do we want?
I look, at US average person carbon footprint, enormous. And so I sort of see these huge gaps, we're over here, we have everything, but we need to stop. And then there's the majority of the world is living essentially in poverty. The societal collapse is already happening in Africa, in Southeast Asia. The resources are already short there, and there's already the effects of that. I mean, millions of migrants on the move because of war. And it's actually funny because I'm kind of from the parental phase, I'm in between Dale and Justine. And so one of the conversations that my husband and I are having is we're in this house that's going to be very shortly way too big for us. And so the question is, what's next? And I have to tell you that I do think about societal collapse, because I think about other points in our life where we might have moved to California. And I think, God, we didn't.
Yeah, that's what I was about to say, that if we look at the way that so many people in the US or UK still kind of think, oh, we're invulnerable, we're rich, we'll engineer our way out of this. Well, I bet that's what a lot of people in California were thinking until recently. And I can tell you, a lot of them are not thinking that anymore. And the same in Germany. You look at the recent floods in Germany, so many people killed, such a vast area inundated and swept away. And Germany is about the best prepared country in the world in terms of flood defenses. I mean, it's way better than most of the US and the UK. If it can happen in Germany, it can happen anywhere where there is water, and there is going to be water kind of everywhere soon, except where there is drought and desert. So, this kind of pride, it comes before a fall, and that's one of the reasons why I'm not super optimistic about our chances of getting through this. And when I say our chances, I mean including in the rich countries where we're sitting right now. I think it's really interesting to think of the coronavirus pandemic as an analogy here. Where are the places that have done the best on coronavirus? Well, they're Taiwan, New Zealand, Sierra Leone. And where are the places that have done the worst? Well, they're the US, the UK, and Brazil. I.e. countries that have been run by crazy populists, but 2 of the 3 countries are very wealthy countries, obviously on a worldwide scale. We've seen in the coronavirus pandemic that we are not invulnerable to entering into a chaotic situation where we have unusually high death rates. Well, why assume it's going to be different on the climate front? So again, I say what I said before. Yeah, sure. We need to be helping right now people who are in terrible shape in Bangladesh, in low-lying island states, in parts of Africa. But we also need to be not making the rash assumption that, well, we're going to be okay. No, we are potentially highly vulnerable as well. And we need to be changing our systems, and we need to be wising up to the fact that we are not going to engineer our way out of this. We are not going to survive behind ever higher walls if that's all we try to do. They will be fragile. The only way we get through this is by transforming our systems in a way that works with nature, not against nature, and that works collectively and intelligently in the kind of way, for example, that the UK and the US populations did during the Second World War.
I think it's interesting, just getting back to a point you made earlier that you mentioned development and growth, because we live in a city that is rapidly changing and has lots of new development going, lots of skyscrapers going up. The downtown is being totally transformed. And Amy, I guess you're part of the zoning. I didn't know you had a role with this. Is it the zoning board?
So this was during the first round of development. That committee was, we got a little too rowdy and we were dispatched.
Okay. But that's interesting though. I'd like to hear that story later, you know, as I'm on this ecology and natural resources advisory council. That's a new committee. And there's this tension of wanting to work with government and wanting to work with our leaders to help kind of, you know, help steer the city to a better vision. But at the same time, it's like we can't offend anyone. Or if you know, do something that maybe comes out against development and growth, then, you know, you're going to be kicked out, basically.
Yes, and the city, yes,
they don't want to hear that message. Like it's okay to kind of greenwash things and but as long as you don't stop the development, don't stop economic growth, then we invite your comments.
Yes.
So I'm feeling that tension a little bit lately on some particular issues, things that have happened lately.
So that's why we're so far from where we need to be. You know, one of the things that does depress me quite a bit is the way that it's still so difficult to question the completely ludicrous ideology that I call growthism, which says economic growth is more important than everything else, including having somewhere nice to live, being healthy, having a future. You know, none of these things matter. It's all about just those numbers. It's crazy.
Yep. On to gross national happiness instead.
Thank you.
Indeed.
Thank you.
Well, thank you all. This was very lively and a very interesting discussion. I'm so grateful to Rupert for informing us of many things, and to Amy and Justine for coming in on this conversation.